Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin Butterfield, the director of the John W. Kluge Center. So excited to have a presentation from AJ Aiseirithe in conversation with Julie Winch on a topic that she's been exploring across the past 6 months as a staff fellow here at the Kluge Center. AJ Aiseirithe is a historian of the U.S. Specializing in the Civil War and Reconstruction era. She received her PhD in history from the University of Chicago. In 2018, she actually gave the U.S. Capitol Historical Society's Black History Month lecture on Frederick Douglass. And in 2016, she co-edited a volume of new scholarship on Wendell Phillips, published by LSU Press, other publications, and other accomplishments. I could go on and on. Let me tell you also about our other guest, Julie Winch, Emerita Professor of History at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. She's published 6 books, among them A Gentleman of Color, The Life of James Forten, and we will be hearing about James Forten today, which won the American Historical Association's Wesley Logan Prize. Other titles, the Comorgans, One Family History of Race in America, 2011, and Between Slavery and Freedom, Free People of Color in America from Settlement to the Civil War in 2014, which was named a Choice Outstanding Academic Title. She has degrees from Cambridge University, London University, and a PhD from Bryn Mawr. So delighted to be with both of you, AJ and Julie. I am going to disappear while you dive in to the story of Robert Purvis. And I also want to encourage everyone as we're listening to be thinking of questions that you want to bring to our panelists today. You can submit those at any time, and we'll come to those at about 45 minutes past the hour. AJ, I think I'm going to hand things over to you, and thank you so much for doing this.
Great. Thank you. So I have big thanks to all the staff at the Kluge Center and Kevin and his team, to the Kluge Center itself for awarding me the fellowship, to Julie Winch for joining us for this. So I've been working on Robert Purvis off and on for about the past decade. Just some basics about who he is to frame our discussion, who he was. Robert Purvis lived from 1810 to 1898. He was a mixed-race civil rights activist who was a contemporary of Frederick Douglass. Robert Purvis was leading civil rights protests in Philadelphia before Douglass had even come north. Robert Purvis's father died when Robert was about 16, and at that time, Robert, his mother, and his brothers inherited considerable wealth. At the age of 21, Robert Purvis married Harriet, the daughter of the wealthy and influential African-American sailmaker James Forten. Purvis was a founding member of the American Anti-Slavery Society. He was an early organizer of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. He led, participated in, and financially supported a number of civil rights actions and protests into his old age. One thing I wanted to address out of the gate, thanks to, there's the Kluge Center put together a great poster about pointing to the conundrum that Purvis is challenging to study because he left, the poster says no papers. So I wanted to point out it's not strictly true that he left no papers, only that he left behind very, very few. Robert Purvis is fairly well known to historians. He will come up in an internet search at places like blackpast.org and many others. He's included in several of the anthologies that came out around the time of the Civil Rights Movement and inspired by the Civil Rights Movement, you know, these collections of famous Black Americans. He's in a number of those. There was a 2007 biography of him by the late Margaret Hope Bacon called But One Race. Still, when you consider the circumstances, it is a very curiously few papers that he left, indeed. His life, like Douglass's, spanned most of the 19th century. Besides being a founding member of the American Anti-Slavery Society, he was its last surviving member. The Society's founder and president, William Lloyd Garrison, for instance, left reams of letters and personal papers that fill several volumes. Frederick Douglass, Purvis's contemporary and another African-American, left several massive collections. Purvis knew all of these people and many more. He was involved with a great many organizations and initiatives. civic and literary organizations, anti-slavery organizations, the Underground Railroad, and many more. All this in a period when any communication not done in person was put in writing. My research suggests that at most a few dozen letters survive, and these are scattered among the collections of others, including Garrison. So this is only one reason why it's such a gift to have Julie Winch with us. She wrote the definitive biography of Robert Purvis's father-in-law, James Fortin, a famous Black American who also left next to no papers. It's called A Gentleman of Color, and it is a masterclass in how to track down sources to reconstruct a life and an extended family, how to make a silent past come to life and speak. So why study Robert Purvis? As I noted, he played a role in many important movements and events of the 19th century. His civil rights work deserves to be better remembered. So I found that a lot of what draws me to him are some interesting tensions. You know, a lot of you may be familiar with a phrase the Quakers used a lot, to be in the world but not of it. And it strikes me that in many situations and contexts, Robert Purvis is sort of in a world, but not necessarily of it. So one example would be that he was active in a number of the colored conventions movement, a lot of those meetings, but he also took the position, he was among those who resisted the use of color designations for their organizations and their initiatives, which became a fierce debate among African-American leaders in the antebellum era. He was very close to very many Quakers. He established a home right next to the Byberry Friends meeting. He worked very closely with them. He sent his children to Quaker school. He partnered with them in many, many initiatives throughout his life, and yet never joined the Society of Friends. So those are just a couple of examples in which Purvis stands apart. Like he goes his own way. He's clearly somebody who knew his own mind and was a bit of an iconoclast. And so it just makes one curious about, in a lot of instances, what he was thinking and what more we might know. So I'm happy to say more. But I didn't know if you had anything to add to that, Julie.
Well, I just find him remarkable. I mean, I encountered him, obviously, when I was doing my work on James Fortin. And I really thought about the context into which he was born. Very light complexioned. He could pass very readily, lots and lots of money, and connections in Britain through his father. It would have been very easy, and I'm sure very tempting at different times, for him to say, I give up, let me just pass into the majority community in the United States, or let me cross the ocean. But he makes this conscious decision, no, this is who I am, even though, as you pointed out, he would really cross-question identifying people by the color of their skin, by the racial background. But he, in a sense, knows where he stands, and he's pulled into the Fortin orbit in his teenage years. And I've argued in my biography there's something James Fortin becoming the father that he has lost, because his father does die when Robert Purvis is 16, and he's been physically a somewhat distant figure, because deeply bonded though his father is, William Purvis Sr., he's making his money in business. He's traveling to different places. And so he's not there constantly in Robert Purvis's life. So I'm fascinated to see him pulled into the Fortin family circle.
Right. And many scholars have shown, you among them, how the extent to which, at the time, William Lloyd Garrison is founding the Liberator and is founding the American Anti-Slavery Society. He is building on organization among Black communities, particularly in Philadelphia, and relying on them. So when we were talking and thinking about Purvis's relationship with Fortin, it struck me that one thing Fortin provides is sort of a pathway, a model of a Black activist, for an activist of color, for Robert Purvis, because with his inheritance, he didn't need to work.
Yes.
Whereas, as you've shown so wonderfully, Fortin built that sailmaking business from nothing, and it was a big part of his identity.
Yeah.
But Purvis was an investor. He was a farmer. He did a lot of different things. But if he had an identity, it seems to me it was in reform. And so I would imagine that if this is why we would love to have, personal papers, family papers, but I would imagine that, to be a teenager when he lost his dad and to see James Fortin already a pillar of the community, already standing up for Black rights, must have, I think, been an inspiration in a key way for Purvis, suggesting a path that he might follow for himself.
And you've mentioned what a savvy business person Purvis is. He can support these causes that matter so much to him because he is not looking at how can he keep a roof over his family's head, how is he going to be able to pay the grocery bills. This is somebody who knows the value of a dollar, and he buys land, he invests in the right kinds of things that will yield a profit. And you've got to kind of hand it to him that he does put his money where his mouth is. He is very generous to William Lloyd Garrison. He is very generous to a host of reform causes. He can afford to be, but let's face it, there are other people who do have money who keep it to themselves. His family never wants for anything, but he is incredibly generous with the money he has.
Yes, and early on, a lot of those are literary societies among people of color, giving them access when the best schools and libraries were closed to them. So, and there's quite a lot of good work on this, and there's more every day about these literary societies organized and led both by men and by women. But there's a list of them that Purvis supports, and that he and Harriet and the Fortin women attend, found, support, move forward. And that was a key way of, bringing others along with them, trying to develop the community so that, other people of color could aspire to more than maybe what Philadelphia would have wanted to give them.
Yeah, they can buy books. I mean, they can have them in their homes and keep them to themselves. But both Robert and Harriet are aware that that is not the case for so many people. They cannot turn up, even when a literary society will proclaim it is open to all people, and it's not open if you're not white.
Right.
And that is something they deplore, and they're in a situation to be able to try to address that.
Right. Right. I imagine too that is it seems to me a constant refrain in Purvis's life because he was so often taken for white. And he recounts in stories told of him, in some stories he shared that survive in the newspapers, for instance, he tells these stories of white people interacting with him on the assumption that he's white, and he sort of leads them along just far enough for them to embarrass themselves or reveal their bigotry, right? And then he reveals himself. But he had this great phrase that appears in a number of places, and that he and Fortin cited in a number of the protest pamphlets they wrote together, where they referred to the wavering and uncertain shades of white. And I noticed that they used that over and over, but that was definitely something that Purvis felt keenly, that that, he could be considered good enough as long as they assumed he was white, and he excelled in all of these things. He was acknowledged, his success in business, his success in oratory, in his talents, he won prizes for his farming, for his poultry and his livestock. And yet, once people learn of his color and his, ancestry, then all kinds of walls come up. And that must have been very galling.
Yes. And to think of the situation to which he and Harriet are bringing their children. And I would throw in there, we've talked about this, the marriage between Robert and Harriet is very much based on affection. It endures, what is it, 18? I can't remember offhand.
31.
31. And it endures until she dies in 1875.
Right.
And it's not a marriage of convenience. It's not him making an ideological statement. It's not a money grab on the part of James Forten. Oh, I can get this wealthy young man for my daughter. So you see, this is very much not Mrs. Bennet of Pride and Prejudice looking for money. Right. This is a close bond, and it's a marital bond that survives the deaths of several of their children. It endures.
And the records of the organizations give us some inkling into this, but the extent to which they were partners. I mean, she is working right alongside him in all his aid to fugitives. So I don't even remember if I've said this already, but Robert Purvis was an early and a central figure in the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia in coordinating the needs of people passing through. And Harriet was at his side. Harriet is a pillar of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. She's in the suffrage organizations, and he's active in those as well. These organizations to defend women's right to vote.
Yes.
So yes, all along, it's really striking. It would be fun to see more of that from the inside.
Yeah, we would love to have the kind of personal papers. We do have some of these as you've dug out, people who do visit the Purvis home,
right,
and comment on the sort of social setting in which they find themselves, the warm welcome they get. I think one of them mentions, what a comforting place it is. And we would love more, but I think with any historical figure, we would love more.
Right.
We'd love to have something that's not just the official record of an organization, but talks about, somewhere between that and someone needing to post everything about their lives on Facebook.
Right. Well, for me, it comes back again, as I said before, to the way in which he's sort of going his own road. I mean, he's close to the Society of Friends, but chooses not to join them. And I would like to know why, what that's about. There's affinity, but something leading him to keep back.
Yes.
And in so many ways as well, I would like more insight into this question of the color designations. So I've said this before, but I was pleased to discover while researching during my fellowship period, there's a scholar named Joan Bryant who's working on this. She published an essay in a volume of essays about the colored convention movement. And her essay focused on this issue of helping us understand what was at stake in the color designations.
The phone was supposed to have been shut off. I apologize for that.
That's all right. That's all right. I can't hear it.
9 times out of 10, it's a junk call. I think my husband grabbed it really quickly.
That's good. That's good. Yes, but I was saying, because it's kind of curious, and it's one of the things that that contributes to some alienation, some temporary alienation between, for instance, Purvis and Douglas.
Yes.
And a number of Purvis's comrades charged that Purvis opposed color designations because he could pass. But
Yeah.
clearly he wasn't the only one. And there were more identifiably African-American comrades who also took the ground that if we want to assert our rights as equal Americans, if we want to get the broader public to understand that we are the same as other people with the same wants, needs, aspirations, rights,
Yeah.
then does it make sense for us to designate all of our organizations and our initiatives as Black this, Colored that, African that? It's an interesting question.
Yes.
And part of what's interesting too, and this is something I've noted in my studies of abolitionism, is that some of the people who gave Purvis a really hard time about this in the 1830s and 40s, like, this is crazy, Black men have to lead this for other men of color. There's no other way. There's no other way we can help ourselves. Some of those people come around over the ensuing decades to understanding the benefit of making assertions on the ground of equal rights.
Yeah.
And they start to get it. So it's one of those, I look forward to, I think Joan Bryan will be bringing out a book on this, and I think it will help us, and it will shed light on this effort that Fortin and Purvis were a part of together. And while Purvis could pass as white, Fortin couldn't.
Yeah.
And yet they were equally adamant, along with a number of other people, about this. So there are these, my interest in Purvis also is the ways in which he can illuminate these questions about the struggle for justice.
Yes.
Things that at least appeared to be resolved in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and some of those issues that are still with us. So that's why I intend to stick with him, because I think he has more to tell us.
I think he does. He's somebody that in my own research, it took only so far, because obviously my interest was in his father-in-law, but I couldn't help looking through Harriet's life, and then obviously through Robert's life, of how, if things have been complicated back in the 30s and the 40s, the complications were the same but different in the 1860s, 70s, and as we said, Purvis lived a long life. Poor Harriet succumbed to tuberculosis, but he lived more than 2 decades beyond her death. And his relationships with his children are fascinating. The Purvises did have 8 children. 4 sadly died. Well, 3 sons died relatively young. There was a daughter who died a couple of years after her mother. So there are really 4 children who lived to maturity. And Purvis has fascinating relationship with each of them. And exploring those can reveal so much.
Right. So one of the things I discovered in my research is that there are a number of letters between Frederick Douglass and Charles Purvis, Robert's son, in the Library of Congress collection of Frederick Douglass papers. And there's one in particular in which Charles writes to Frederick, he said, "My father instructs me to say he will extend the olive branch at your next meeting." And this is in the 1880s.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that Charles was the conduit for a sort of rapprochement. But yeah, Charles becomes a force in his own right, which is another reason why one would want a family collection. So there's Purvis marrying into what's already an illustrious family.
Yes.
Robert and Harriet living their own illustrious reform life that is impactful, as they say. And then they have this progeny who continue this struggle in a lot of arenas, and they're worth remembering as well. And then his niece, so Robert's brother-in-law, Robert Fortin, his daughter Charlotte marries Francis Grimke.
Yep.
And together they become part of the post-war Black elite in Washington, D.C. So there's this wonderful tradition keeps going on and on. And
One of the
One would like
people,
to get more than glimpses.
yeah, one of the people I find so interesting that I've done relatively little work on her is Robert and Harriet's daughter, who does not marry, whose birth name is Harriet, but she's called Hattie
Mm-hmm.
to distinguish her from her mother, who is a very forceful champion for women's rights.
Mm-hmm.
And she speaks about women's rights. And then she again is close to a niece who is a pioneering female physician. So again, these people they're in a lot of different places. I can't say places we wouldn't expect them to be, but they just crop up in in all these worthy causes of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I hope you will go beyond Robert, which I know you will, and look at where some of the children are.
Yes, I would like to, because it's an American story.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose that sounds cliche, but I don't think so, because if you think of the influence marrying into the Fortin family, and Fortin remembered the colonies, the colonial era.
Yes.
And then to see it continue through, the 30s.
Yeah.
Like some of Robert's own children live that
Yes.
long, and then their grandchildren. So it's an American story. It's a story of reform. It's a story of change. I think it could really bring a lot to light that I think it would be interesting. These are interesting people in and of their own right, but they can tell us more about ourselves as well in important ways.
And there are those who choose him. And one of the sons eventually goes to England, and he goes. This is Granville Sharp Purvis,
Mm-hmm.
One of the younger sons, and he goes to England because he has married a woman who was classed as white.
Mm-hmm.
And the state in which they are living, which is Michigan, at the time, banned interracial marriage. If they want to live together as husband and wife, they have a child, they have to leave the country. They do what Robert might have done decades earlier. But even though they marry in a state, they go to Pennsylvania to marry, they can be married there. But given that his business is in Michigan, what they're left to do is he retires somewhat early, sells up, invests the money, and off they go to England. So you see these people geographically move, and you see them move for different reasons.
Right. And one would want to know, so Granville Sharp, he's named for a British abolitionist.
Yes.
And what does he know when he goes of his paternal ancestry?
Yeah. Back
in Britain? Presumably something, he knows something, but how much? Does he reestablish any connections? And what kinds of family stories continue?
Yes. We would love to know those. Those may remain to be found. Letters from British families, in a private collection, in an old trunk somewhere. I mean, that's stereotypical, but it does happen. I've said, we met cousin so-and-so. And how do they respond to these American relatives? Maybe viewing racial designation in a somewhat different way. Is the linkage so weak by then that Granville Sharp Purvis would simply not have pursued any kind of contact because he wasn't raised with much contact?
It's possible as well, but one of them, I think I got this from your work. Does Granville, or is it Granville and his wife, they turn up in California where Charles has moved?
The wife does after he dies. The wife and daughter come back to the United States, and they're making what is actually a very hazardous voyage from Britain to the United States. But when you've got submarine warfare out there. This is the period of the Lusitania. I mean, she decides that does the wife that she and the daughter will return. The daughter has, in fact, been born in the United States, but they will return to the United States. So they live in California. Well, it's a long story, but they do turn up in California. Then she goes to Michigan. But I did find out that I think it was one of the other relatives, one of the brother Charles, actually makes trips to Britain. And he's going over to visit his brother. And I wondered, are they just going on vacation? Then I realized, no. How did you keep in touch with family? She said, letters. But you're not going to be able to FaceTime with them. If you want to spend time in their company, you have to cross the ocean. And people travel, I think, more extensively than we thought. When it's not just getting a plane ticket. It is, a lengthy sea voyage.
Yes.
I found that really interesting.
Yes. I know that you covered Robert Purvis's passport. I've seen some claims. I'm not sure this is accurate. Was he the first man of color to be issued a United States passport?
I'm not absolutely sure. He gets his passport, but of course, this covering letter, when it's been denied the first time, it's a letter that he probably never got to see and would have been quite angry about. Even our friends don't get it. Where this friend in Philadelphia, white friend, kind of intercedes on his behalf with the Department of State and says, he's really rich. He should get a passport. And he's not very black either.
Right. Back to these uncertain and wavering shades of white.
Yeah, Purvis would have been mortified by that.
Right.
But, this acquaintance obviously thought he was helping things along. Right. And of course, Purvis does get his passport, does go to Britain. The only reason he doesn't take his wife along, doesn't take Harriet along, is that they already have one child and she's pregnant with their second child. It looks like he had intended to take her, and then, then they discovered that she was pregnant, and it didn't seem like such a good idea. He has a very enjoyable trip to England, and one, again, meets all sorts of people. You mentioned, runs into Daniel O'Connell. And again, one would love some more material from people's diaries about having run into him.
Right. And this is what, almost a decade before, maybe, I don't know, some 6 years or so before Douglas's trip to the UK.
Yes. And of course, Purvis, he's been denied passage on one vessel when it's learned that a man of color will travel. He points out, if he'd been a crew member in, socially less elevated position, that would have been fine. There were lots of African-American sailors and stewards, but he is traveling as a gentleman. And so he's denied passage. First time around, he goes on another vessel where it's just assumed that he is white. He will pass when he needs to do so. And there are a couple of occasions on which he passes in order to assist fugitives. So he will do what he needs to do when he needs to do it. And as you say, in other circumstances, to lead people on to condemn themselves out of their own mouths. And he does actually on his return trip to Britain. There's quite a funny episode about that. But you have really mined a lot of sources.
Well, I'm glad you think so. There's more. But yes, he's embedded in all these networks. And so he comes up in other people's papers, and he just raises so many questions for me about particular, in the era I'm interested of the war and Reconstruction years. What could he point us to? But yeah, there's this mind. So another one we've only just briefly touched on this, but when the woman suffragists say, we will not delay our claim to the vote in order that the vote going to just Black men can move forward. We want to insist on women being enfranchised at the same time. Robert Purvis stands with them.
Yeah.
But my own research suggests that that's been that can be misleadingly characterized. I mean, because so many of his the fellow Black men who believe strongly that the Black men's claim is urgent, they also support women's rights. So you find, again, like on the question of color designations, most of the men who fall on opposite sides at a particular meeting in a particular year really agree. They take the same ground before or after, or in another, in another context. So a lot of them shared this view because they understood. A lot of Black families would have been happy to have Black women enfranchised if that's what came first.
Yeah.
But for Robert Purvis, perhaps where he does stand out is he had no hesitation.
Yeah.
But that's also the way it's reported. Again, that's something I would like to dig into. Could the sources surface? Because, and I was thinking about this last night. I think this is right to say. I'm sure if I'm wrong, someone in the audience will correct me. But I was thinking that unlike Douglas, Fortin and Purvis both had been disfranchised. They were men who had enjoyed the vote, yes, and had it taken away from them.
Yes.
So I wondered if that was part of why, perhaps for Robert Purvis, Black men getting the right to vote doesn't seem like this door is going to open and everything's going to be changed forever. He may have seen it as more precarious, as in fact some abolitionists predicted beforehand it might be. Many of them said it's something that could be easily lost. Yeah. So it's an interesting. And again, I think one needs to keep in mind that Elizabeth Cady Stanton is writing up some of these reports of the meeting. She's not the only one. There are newspaper reports. There are other white women suffragists. So, it's not that this didn't happen, but I think she's pleased to have Robert Purvis to point to, as she's pleased to have Sojourner Truth, and to say, look, these people stand with me. But I also think there was a case to be made that she was minimizing the urgency for Black men to have the vote in that moment. Yeah. So again, there's, I would have liked to see, how does Robert Purvis weigh this? And how does he discuss it with these people, with the white reformers, with his fellow women suffragists, with the Black men he's working with? Yeah. How are these conversations unfolding? And I don't know. One can only hope we can learn more.
And how does he discuss it with his wife and with his daughter? Are they saying, well, no, we kind of take the position that race first, we'll get the vote somewhere along the line, or are they pushing him, or are they all together on this?
I've wondered about that because I did this project on Wendell Phillips some years back, and Wendell Phillips was someone who frequently wrote in letters and things about his mother's influence on him was towering and enduring. She was evidently a strong-willed woman. I think she put the fear of God into many people. But he often said later in his later years and after she'd passed that thanks to her, he's not afraid of strong women. He was not intimidated by strong women. And sometimes it's the way these figures talk about one another that's so interesting. I forget who it was who suggested that Emerson, while he admired Fuller, was actually intimidated by her. So I don't know if I saw this or if it just occurred to me that Robert Purvis also seems to have been a man who was not intimidated by strong women. Yeah. So I think that that's something that he and Phillips had in common. And so he might not have hesitated. I just think he certainly would have thought about what the cause for equal justice needs in that critical moment. I think, and I'll say this till I die, we still don't know enough about the Civil War and Reconstruction eras, particularly the Reconstruction. It's not well understood. We all need to understand it better. But things are changing fast and they are moving fast. And I think the movement's trying to catch up. So I know he would have thought about what does the cause for equal rights mean? But I think also when someone says, should Black women vote, I imagine he wouldn't hesitate. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So,
because as you've said with Reconstruction, it's moving at a different pace in different geographical areas.
Right. That's right. That is very true.
What's going on in Pennsylvania, and then what's going on in the greater Philadelphia area, profoundly different from what is going on in Virginia, what is going on in South Carolina.
Right.
What are the imperatives? They're different, and you're trying to get national movements together, but if you've just come through a civil war that has blown apart that notion of a unified nation, what's come out of it?
Right.
And that is, to say that's a complicated issue is far too vague, and
yes,
but it is.
And these, I've been pointing to these tensions. I think that's what attracts me as a scholar, is to these, the in but not of, the, this side but the other side. That a lot of the reformers understood at one and the same time that this was a historic moment. This Civil War, immediate post-Civil War period, possibilities were opening that not only were not open before, but might not be open again. That was something Elizabeth Cady Stanton, to her credit, saw very clearly.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think a lot of these same reformers understood they weren't going to get everything they hoped for. They knew that in that moment. So how do you walk through that? How do you prioritize? And I think the answer is, they all answer that question differently and at different paces. So, but yes, it's a tumultuous time, and I'm not sure we appreciate how rapidly things are changing in less than a decade. So it would be so fascinating to, Robert was at the center of these conversations.
Yes.
And thinking about them very deeply, he could just contribute so much. So somewhere, I'm hoping that there's a trunk somewhere.
Yeah,
a storage unit, but
every now and again it happens. You look in that unexpected place, and wow.
Right.
So if anybody is out there who has a trunk or a box and they haven't explored, please look inside.
Right. And get in touch with us.
Well, I think I've been enjoying this immensely, but I think that's a great time to turn to some questions. We do have a few questions from the audience already that I will read out for you, but I believe we'll still have time after these. So if anybody's still thinking, go ahead and type them into the Q&A. We'll start with Kathleen Friedel, who says, "What a privilege to listen in on this exchange. If we somehow subtract Purvis, do we lose something critical about abolition or reform in the 19th century or 19th century history more generally?"
I would say yes, because of the junctures at which he stands. The privilege, the education, the wealth, while at the same time he's working in, with, and for the Black community, deeply embedded with fellow activists. I think he brings a perspective that not a lot of his fellow abolitionists, not a lot of his fellow Quakers would have shared exactly. So yeah, for me, I think his voice is crucial. And I wouldn't say unique, but there aren't a lot of people who occupy that, positionality, for lack of a better word.
I agree. Yes.
Great. Next question will go to Melvin Rogers, who was a Kluge scholar not too long ago. So nice to see you here, Melvin. Melvin says, "Thank you for this. I wonder if you might speculate about Purvis's background, political, philosophical views informing his activism. James Pennington, David Walker, Maria Stewart, and Martin Delaney all had very rich notions of humanity, human agency, rights, God, etc., that served as the basis for their activism. Can you speak to what philosophical views informed Purvis?"
I might have to send that over to Julie, because some of the questions it makes me think of is, do we know what any contents of his library might have been? I mean, I would imagine he's reading the major works that his comrades are reading. He was very well educated, but we don't, that's one of the things we lack for not having these papers is these exchanges. And I came across a letter on the fellowship from that McCune Smith writes to James Fortin Jr. writes to James McCune Smith, where they're talking about, I think it's in the Boston Public Library collection online. And he's talking about some works that influenced him. So I'm not going to remember off the top of my head what they were, but do we have any sense of what Robert Purvis read?
Oh, I don't. I just know he does read widely. It comes out in some of what he writes. And of course, he has the means, as I mentioned, to be able to, you know, if a work interests him, he can buy it. He doesn't have to find some stratagem, maybe borrow it or somehow get at it. In terms of his religious faith, also, that you raised this, that is so puzzling because, as you've said, he is so close to Quakers, but he never. It's not a question of him applying to be a friend and being turned down. We don't think he ever did make that step. He's attending an Episcopal church for until he and Harriet leave in 1848. But I'm not sure whether church attendance is something he does because you just do it, or whether there's a deep spirituality there. I really don't know. I would say he doesn't turn up on the vestry at St. Thomas's, but maybe just looking at the fact that time and that, you know, how much does he want to dedicate to the minutiae of church government? Does that necessarily imply he is not a person of deep faith? I just don't know. Did you get any sense of his religious background?
No, but it struck me the other day that, and again, I hope I don't get the details of Douglas wrong, but I can say, as a Washingtonian, that many churches claim Douglas because he attended there some of the time, or he spoke there, and yet he seems to have belonged exclusively to none of them. So I find it striking that this is somewhat true of Robert Purvis as well. St. Thomas, there are these other churches he may appear in or speak in. You know, ministers that he's working with, and yet doesn't let, and certainly the friends, and doesn't let any of them claim him. So I don't know what that says. I mean, the broader context of a lot of abolitionists had the same complaints you cite in Purvis's leaving St. Thomas, and that is that the church wouldn't take a strong enough anti-slavery stand. So someone like Lydia Maria Child talked about doing church from home. I mean, there was some of the coming out, they would have called it, from what they saw as corrupt churches. So, well, and then they become interested in variations of free thought. So all these things are in the air. And certainly we know that Robert attends the meetings of the Longwood Meeting of Progressive Friends, which I think is founded in 1853. So he's at least a fellow traveler with free thinkers, progressive thinkers, people trying to carve out a new a new path, who
Yeah.
felt like the established denominations weren't meeting their needs. But more than that, in terms of specifics about Purvis, I can't say.
Yeah. But it is interesting if you compare him to somebody like Mariah Stewart or David Walker, with that tremendous reverence for Richard Allen and
Absalom Jones, right?
Yes, that is not Purvis,
right? And yet he's close with many of those figures.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. So we have an anonymous attendee who says, I'm new to the historical evolution of abolition, so I'm very grateful for this discussion and education. I'm curious if the panelists could comment on how and what kind of ripple effects of the work done by 19th century abolitionists, including Purvis, can be felt in the environment of modern day abolitionism, meaning prison, police abolition, and those sorts of movements today.
Oh, that is such an interesting question. I don't know. There has been work in terms of the personnel tracing the lineal descendants of abolitionists. Do you find the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren involved in whatever form abolition takes today? But then again, it's multiple forms. I don't know, AJ, what's your take on that?
It is an interesting question. If someone has the answer, I would be interested. I mean, for me, I'm a historian of the 19th century, and the context was different. So I'm sure and for obvious and very good reasons, the 19th century movement and its successes, of course, influence these abolitionist movements, both regarding the carceral state and of modern human trafficking, as they should. And yet I would be one that would resist a one-to-one. I'm not sure that lessons from, while lessons we can learn lessons that can be of use in these modern struggles, the struggles are not identical.
Yeah.
It's a different context. And one of them was the way enslavement was the law of the land. It was just conditions like that, they conditioned the struggle in a different way that you can't simply map onto conditions today. But yeah, sure. I continue to watch with interest to see how these things develop and in what ways the abolitionist movement is invoked.
Yes.
Great. So we have one more question. I think this will be the last one, from Kathleen Lynch, who says, this is a fascinating conversation. Let's say we never find more papers, more textual documentation. Does this example point to a kind of role, that of patron, that of activist, that we don't have enough traditional kinds of evidence to support, that we need to address differently with a new methodology?
I always live in hope that papers will show up, or especially now. I take the question, and again, I think it's a great question. And I am not naive enough to say, oh, everything's been digitized. But newspapers, more and more databases of historical newspapers, and you start to plug in different search terms, and you don't know what's going to come out. But some of the time, it is so useful. I've had numerous discoveries where I wasn't even looking. I maybe had 5 minutes between doing one thing and another. I said, oh, let me go check this database again. And all of a sudden you're looking at something you don't quite believe you're seeing it, but it's the thing you've been looking for. But I also do agree, about different methodologies. And AJ, you really dug into this. What have you found, or wish you could have found, or think you could have looked at in a different light?
Well, I have to say, I've learned so much from your work on Fortin on the ways that the strategies one can apply to tease more information out of sources that seem at first like they don't want to speak. So that's been a wonderful help. And I intend to model that a lot. But I was thinking also that one way in which we can get more light on someone like Purvis is has to do with the way they're remembered. The way other people talk about them. So I did I had a very limited time a year or so ago to look at, through the papers, the library's collection of the NAACP, and I saw Purvis names in there. I was not able to establish that they are connected to Robert's family, but that would be interesting to find out, because then that would point to a longer legacy. But when I was in Philadelphia last month, and there are 2 properties related to Robert Purvis still standing. One is the last house he lived in that is currently up for sale. And once it's sold, which it may already have been, it will be torn down. But there is a historical marker outside the house. That one, that talks about his work in the Underground Railroad, except that he didn't live in this house till after the Civil War. And the other was this hall that he caused to be built in the suburb of Byberry, where he relocated after a particularly violent racist mob in the 1840s. And this was a hall built for free discussion. Because Robert was among the abolitionists who supported the erection of Philadelphia Hall that was destroyed in a fire by another racist mob. So this hall still stands. And I came across, a friend sent a link to a local historian who's done work on Purvis in Byberry, according to which, as of a year ago, the Byberry Friends meeting has acquired this property and intends to turn it into a local history center. So they are certainly aware of Purvis's role. He's mentioned on that historical marker, and I can hope that a local history center would help bring Robert and his family and his activism forward to a new generation.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place to stop. Thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure our guests have as well. Thank you to everybody for joining us.